Hey there, truth seekers. So here's the deal. Everything you learned about ancient history? Yeah, there's a solid chance it's incomplete at best and hilariously wrong at worst. We're talking about civilizations that supposedly never existed, cities that couldn't have been built with the technology available, and archaeological finds that make professors sweat nervously during tenure reviews. Today we're kicking off a journey into the archaeological rabbit hole, where ancient maps show continents that weren't supposed to exist, where primitive people somehow moved stones that would make modern engineers quit their jobs, and where the official timeline has more holes than Swiss cheese. Before we dive into this beautiful mess of forgotten worlds and inconvenient artifacts, do me a favor, smash that like button if you're ready to question everything, and drop a comment telling me what corner of the world you're watching from. I genuinely want to know who's brave enough to join this expedition into history's basement, where all the weird stuff gets shoved. Buckle up, because we're about to explore why the story of human civilization might be way older, way stranger, and way more interesting than anyone's been willing to admit. Let's get into it. So let's talk about maps. Not the boring kind you use to find the nearest gas station, but the kind that make archaeologists nervous and historians uncomfortable. We're talking about ancient cartography that shows places that, according to every textbook ever written, absolutely should not exist. And here's the kicker. These aren't crude doodles made by someone with too much wine and too much imagination. These are detailed, accurate representations of landmasses that our ancestors supposedly had no way of knowing about. Which, unsurprisingly, raises some pretty uncomfortable questions. Take the Piri Reis map from 1513, for example. This Turkish admiral created a world map that's been giving scholars headaches for decades. Now, you'd think a 16th century map wouldn't be that controversial, right? Wrong. This thing shows the coastline of Antarctica. So what, you might say? Well, here's the problem. Antarctica wasn't officially discovered until 1820, and more importantly, the map shows the coastline without ice. The kind of coastline you'd only see if you mapped it before the continent got buried under a mile of frozen water. The last time Antarctica was ice-free? We're talking somewhere between 6,000 to 15,000 years ago, depending on which geologist you ask and how much coffee they've had. But wait, it gets better. The map isn't just vaguely Antarctic-shaped like a lucky guess. It shows geographical features that we only confirmed existed in the 1950s using modern seismic equipment and ground-penetrating technology. Features that are currently under thousands of feet of ice. So either Piri Reis had access to some seriously advanced ice-penetrating vision, or he was copying from much older source maps. Maps that would have been created by civilizations that, according to mainstream history, didn't exist. Naturally, the academic response has been less, wow, this is fascinating, and more, let's not talk about this at dinner parties. And Piri Reis isn't alone in this club of cartographic troublemakers. There's the Orontius Phineas map from 1531, which also shows Antarctica, again without ice, and with mountain ranges and rivers in roughly the correct positions. Then you've got the Buache map from 1754, created by French geographer Philippe Buache, which depicts Antarctica as two separate landmasses divided by a waterway. Seems random, right? Except modern seismic surveys proved he was correct. Beneath all that ice, Antarctica is indeed two separate landmasses. How did an 18th century mapmaker know this? The official explanation is usually something along the lines of lucky guess or he probably extrapolated, which is academic speak for we have no idea, please stop asking. But here's where it gets really interesting. These maps weren't created in a vacuum. Most of them explicitly state they were compiled from much older sources. Piri Reis himself wrote notes on his map saying he used about 20 older charts, including maps from the time of Alexander the Great. So we're not talking about one guy having a really good day with a compass. We're talking about a continuous cartographic tradition spanning potentially thousands of years, based on source material that predates known civilization. Which means somebody was sailing around the world, accurately mapping coastlines and geographical features way before anyone was supposed to have that capability. Not exactly the story you get in your standard world history textbook. Now, medieval maps are a whole other level of weird. You've got the Hereford Mappa Mundi from around 1300, which looks like someone tried to draw the world while describing it over a bad phone connection. It's got Jerusalem at the center, paradise at the top, and various mythical creatures scattered around like decorative afterthoughts. Most historians write these off as religious allegories rather than actual attempts at cartography. Fair enough. But then you've got other medieval maps that show incredible accuracy for regions that Europeans supposedly hadn't explored yet. Islands in the Caribbean appearing on maps before Columbus. Asian coastlines depicted with surprising precision centuries before European contact. Continents in positions that wouldn't be officially charted for hundreds of years. The standard explanation is that medieval cartographers were just really creative, or they were drawing based on rumors and legends from travelers. Which would be a neat theory if the accuracy wasn't so consistently spot on. It's one thing to vaguely gesture in the direction of there might be land over there. It's another thing entirely to draw detailed coastlines, river systems, and mountain ranges that turn out to be correct when we finally get around to checking. With modern equipment. That's not luck, that's knowledge. Knowledge that somebody had, recorded, and passed down through generations, even as civilizations rose and fell. Speaking of things that make academics uncomfortable, let's dive into the world of out-of-place artifacts, or OOP arts, as they're affectionately known in the world of archaeological headaches. These are objects that show up in places they absolutely shouldn't be, either because they're too technologically advanced for their time period, or because they're found in geological layers that predate human civilization by millions of years. And before you ask, no, we're not talking about obvious hoaxes or misidentified rocks. We're talking about objects that have been examined, tested, and verified by multiple sources, yet still don't fit into the neat timeline we've constructed for human history. Let's start with something relatively tame, the Antikythera mechanism. Discovered in a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901, this device is basically an ancient analog computer. It's got dozens of bronze gears arranged in a complex system that could predict astronomical positions, eclipses, and planetary movements with stunning accuracy. The level of engineering is comparable to 18th century clockwork. The problem? It's from around 100 BC. That's right, the ancient Greeks apparently had technology that wouldn't show up again for nearly 2,000 years. Imagine finding a smartphone in a medieval castle, and you'll get a sense of how this discovery went down in archaeological circles. For decades, nobody could figure out what this thing was. It sat in a museum while experts scratched their heads and proposed increasingly wild theories. It wasn't until X-ray technology and modern computer modeling allowed researchers to see inside the corroded bronze that they realized what they were dealing with. And even now, with all our understanding of ancient technology, we can't quite explain how or why the Greeks developed this level of mechanical sophistication, then apparently forgot about it for 2 millennia. It's like humanity hit the snooze button on technological advancement for a couple thousand years. Very efficient use of time, clearly. But the Antikythera mechanism at least fits within known history. It's just unexpectedly advanced. Other artifacts don't even have that excuse. Take the London hammer, found in Texas in 1936, embedded in rock formation dated to the Cretaceous period, over 100 million years old. Now the hammer itself is obviously not 100 million years old, unless dinosaurs were into carpentry. The mystery is how a 19th century style iron hammer ended up encased in rock that supposedly formed long before humans existed. The standard explanation is that minerals can rapidly form around objects under the right conditions, creating the appearance of ancient encasement, which is scientifically plausible, though it doesn't explain all the specifics of this particular case. Then there's the Coso artifact, discovered in California in 1961, which appeared to be a spark plug encased in a rock formation estimated to be 500,000 years old. A spark plug, from 500,000 years before the first car. The immediate response was, obviously this is ancient alien technology, from the fringe crowd, and obviously this is modern contamination, from the mainstream crowd. Turns out it was probably a 1920s champion spark plug that got naturally encased in rapid mineral formation. But the fact that we keep finding modern or advanced objects in supposedly ancient geological contexts suggests either our dating methods have some serious gaps, or geological processes work faster and weirder than we give them credit for. Now, some OOP arts are harder to dismiss. The Dendera light, for example, a set of stone reliefs in the Egyptian temple of Hathor that appear to show what looks suspiciously like a light bulb. You've got a snake-like filament inside a bulged container, connected to what looks like a cable, with a figure that could be interpreted as operating or controlling the device. Mainstream Egyptologists say it's religious symbolism. The snake represents various gods. The bulb is a lotus flower. The whole thing is about creation mythology, which is a perfectly reasonable interpretation. Except for the part where it looks exactly like a Crookes tube, which wouldn't be invented until the 19th century. And the part where some engineers have successfully built working light bulbs based on these reliefs, using only materials the Egyptians had access to. Not saying the ancient Egyptians had electricity, but if they did, this is exactly what the instruction manual would look like. The Baghdad battery is another fun one. These are terracotta pots from around 200 BC, containing copper cylinders and iron rods. Fill them with an acidic solution, and congratulations, you've got a working battery, producing about 1.1 volts. Were ancient Mesopotamians using these to electroplate objects? To produce small amounts of electricity for purposes we can't imagine? Or were they just really elaborate storage containers that happened to function as batteries by complete accident? The academic community is split, which is polite code for, we're arguing about this at conferences and nobody's changing their mind. What makes these artifacts so problematic isn't just that they're technologically unexpected, it's that they challenge the entire narrative of human progress that we've constructed. We like our history linear. Humans started primitive, got gradually smarter, invented agriculture, built cities, developed technology, and here we are scrolling through social media instead of working. Nice, clean, progressive. But these artifacts suggest something messier. Maybe technological advancement isn't a straight line. Maybe civilizations develop advanced capabilities, then lose them. Maybe knowledge gets forgotten, then rediscovered centuries later. Maybe that progression we're so fond of is more like a series of peaks and valleys than a steady climb. And then we've got the geological impossibilities. Objects found in coal seams that formed 300 million years ago. Metal spheres discovered in South African mines in rock dated to 2.8 billion years old. Fossilized human handprints in limestone that shouldn't contain human remains. Now, most of these have explanations that don't require rewriting human history. Contamination, misdating, misidentification. Natural formations that look artificial. The problem is that even after explaining away 99% of these anomalies, you're still left with a handful that don't quite fit. And science doesn't like things that don't fit. The response from mainstream archaeology to these anomalies generally falls into a few categories. First, there's the "it's a hoax" explanation, which is fair because there have been plenty of hoaxes. The Piltdown Man, the Cardiff Giant. Archaeology has been fooled before, so skepticism is warranted. Second, there's the "it's misidentified" explanation. What looks like a battery might be a ritual object. What looks like advanced technology might be natural formation or coincidence, also reasonable. Third, there's the "it's contamination" explanation for geological anomalies. Modern objects somehow got mixed with ancient layers through natural processes. Possible. But then there's the fourth response, which is, let's just not talk about it. And that's where things get interesting. Because there are artifacts sitting in museum storage that don't get displayed. There are finds that get quietly reclassified. There are research papers that don't get published because they challenge established chronology too aggressively. This isn't some grand conspiracy. It's just how academic institutions work. You don't get tenure by proposing radical rewrites of human history. You don't get grants by suggesting that maybe we've been wrong about when civilization started. You definitely don't advance your career by championing artifacts that make your colleagues uncomfortable. The Ica stones are a perfect example of this dynamic. These are andesite stones from Peru, covered with engravings showing humans interacting with dinosaurs, performing surgery, using telescopes, and flying an aircraft. Obviously, this is problematic. The mainstream position is that they're modern forgeries created by local farmers to sell to tourists, which is probably correct for most of them. But some of these stones were documented by Spanish conquistadors in the 1500s, and some have been found in controlled archaeological contexts. So either we're dealing with an incredibly elaborate and long-running hoax spanning centuries, or some of these engravings are genuinely ancient, which means we need to explain how pre-Columbian people knew what dinosaurs looked like. Neither option is comfortable. The pattern repeats across the globe. The Dropa stones from China, discs that supposedly tell the story of an alien crash landing 12,000 years ago. Almost certainly a hoax, but the Chinese government has been weirdly protective about who gets to study them. The Michigan relics, thousands of artifacts supposedly showing advanced pre-Columbian civilization in North America, dismissed as forgeries, though some details are puzzlingly accurate to contexts the forgers shouldn't have known about. The Fuente Magna bowl from Bolivia, covered in what appears to be Sumerian script, found in South America thousands of miles from where Sumerian civilization existed. Easy to dismiss as fake, harder to explain if it's genuine. What's fascinating isn't whether any individual artifact is real or fake. It's the pattern of response. Anomalous artifacts either get absorbed into the mainstream narrative if possible, or they get dismissed as hoaxes or misidentifications if not. There's no middle ground where we say, this is weird, we don't understand it, let's keep investigating. Instead, it's, this fits our model, or this doesn't fit our model, so it's probably fake. Which is understandable from an institutional perspective. You can't rewrite textbooks every time someone finds a weird rock. But it also means that genuine anomalies might get lost in the noise of hoaxes and misidentifications. The real question isn't whether ancient civilizations had smartphones or flew around in helicopters. The real question is whether our timeline of human technological development is as solid as we think it is. Because every culture has legends of golden ages, of times when humanity knew more and could do more before some catastrophe wiped it away. The Sumerians talked about knowledge from before the flood. The Egyptians claimed their civilization was the remnant of something older. Greek philosophers wrote about even more ancient cultures. Hindu texts describe cycles of civilization rising and falling over vast periods of time. And while we tend to write these off as mythology, it's worth noting that these myths are remarkably consistent across cultures that never had contact with each other. What if these weren't myths? What if they were cultural memories of actual events, passed down through oral tradition and slowly transformed into legend? What if human civilization has had multiple runs at advancement, with knowledge being developed, lost, and rediscovered in cycles? It sounds dramatic, but consider this. 99% of human history is prehistoric, meaning we have no written records. Modern humans have existed for roughly 300,000 years. Civilization as we know it has existed for maybe 10,000 years. That leaves 290,000 years of human activity that we know almost nothing about. We assume those were simple hunter-gatherers, living in small groups, developing slowly until the sudden explosion of civilization around 10,000 BC. But what if that assumption is wrong? We know catastrophic events have happened. Meteor impacts, volcanic supereruptions, ice ages, rapid climate shifts. The geological record is full of disasters that would have wiped out any civilization unlucky enough to be in the wrong place. And these events happen on timescales that seem long to us, but are actually pretty frequent in geological terms. A civilization-ending event every 10,000 or 20,000 years wouldn't even show up as unusual in the fossil record. But it would be more than enough to erase most traces of human activity, leaving only the most durable artifacts, massive stone structures, objects buried in specific geological conditions, and cultural memories passed down as myths and legends. The maps suggest somebody was exploring and charting the world long before our official timeline says anyone should have been. The artifacts suggest technological capabilities that appear, disappear, and reappear across vast stretches of time. The geological anomalies suggest either our dating methods have problems, or things we think took millions of years to form can sometimes happen much faster. And the myths suggest cultural memory of advanced capabilities and catastrophic losses. None of this proves anything definitively, but it does suggest that the story of human civilization might be considerably more complex, more interesting, and more mysterious than the version we've been telling ourselves. And honestly, that's way more exciting than thinking we've got it all figured out. So where does that leave us? Standing at the intersection of accepted history and unexplained anomalies, looking at a map that supposedly shouldn't exist, holding an artifact that shouldn't be possible, and wondering if maybe, just maybe, we've been underestimating our ancestors, or overestimating how much we actually know about our own past. Either way, the next time someone tells you with absolute certainty when human civilization began and how it developed, remember the Piri-Reis map, remember the Antikythera mechanism, and remember that history has a funny way of being more complicated than we'd like it to be, and way more entertaining. Now that we've established that human history might be way weirder than advertised, let's talk about why we might not have better evidence of ancient civilizations. Spoiler alert, it's because Earth has a habit of hitting the reset button every few thousand years. And when I say reset button, I mean catastrophic, civilization-ending, goodbye to everything you've ever built level events. The kind of disasters that make modern hurricanes look like a mild inconvenience. We're starting with the Younger Dryas period, which sounds like a botanical term but is actually one of the most dramatic climate events in recent geological history. Picture this. It's about 11,600 years ago, and the Ice Age is winding down. The climate is warming up nicely, glaciers are retreating, and early human societies are probably thinking, finally, things are looking up. Then suddenly, boom, Temperatures plummet back to Ice Age conditions in the span of a few decades. Not centuries, decades. That's like going from spring to winter and staying there for over 1,000 years. Not exactly ideal conditions for building a lasting civilization. Now, for a long time, scientists couldn't figure out what caused this sudden climate reversal. The prevailing theory was that melting glaciers disrupted ocean currents, which somehow triggered a freeze. Which is fine as theories go, except it doesn't quite explain the speed and severity of the change. Enter the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, which proposes something considerably more dramatic. A comet or asteroid fragment slamming into Earth's ice sheets around 12,800 years ago. Because why not add extraterrestrial destruction to the mix? The evidence for this impact is genuinely fascinating and deeply controversial, which is academic speak for people are having very loud arguments about this at conferences. Researchers have found a layer of sediment across multiple continents, containing unusual materials, nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium, and platinum concentrations that typically only show up after high-energy impacts. They've also found evidence of massive wildfires, sudden megafauna extinctions, and a distinctive black matte layer in sediment cores that dates to exactly this period. The proponents of the impact hypothesis look at this and say, obviously something exploded. The skeptics look at the same evidence and say, correlation isn't causation, and also we need more coffee before discussing this further. But here's what makes this particularly relevant to our lost civilization discussion. If something did impact the ice sheets, the consequences would have been biblical. We're talking about instantaneous melting of massive amounts of ice, which means sudden flooding on a scale that makes modern tsunamis look like bathtub overflow. Imagine walls of water, hundreds of feet high, sweeping across coastal regions, carrying ice chunks the size of buildings. Any civilization unlucky enough to be living on coastlines or low-lying areas would have been obliterated in hours. Not years, not months, hours. And since humans have always preferred living near water for obvious reasons, that's exactly where any advanced societies would have been located. The geological evidence suggests sea levels rose approximately 400 feet over the period from the last glacial maximum to the end of the Younger Dryas. 400 feet. That's a 40-story building worth of ocean rise. And while most of that happened gradually over thousands of years, there's evidence of several sudden jumps, periods where sea levels rose dramatically in very short time frame. These are called meltwater pulses, which sounds like a refreshing summer beverage, but was actually more like everything you know is now underwater. Good luck with that. Meltwater Pulse 1A, for instance, occurred around 14,600 years ago and raised sea levels by about 50 feet in less than 500 years. That's roughly 4 inches per year, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that's enough to submerge entire coastal cities within a generation. Your childhood beach becomes your grandchildren's diving spot. And Meltwater Pulse 1B, happening around 11,500 years ago right after the Younger Dryas, was even more dramatic. We're talking potential sea level rises of 10 to 30 feet in just a few centuries. Any coastal civilization would have faced a simple choice: relocate everything you've built inland, or watch it disappear beneath the waves. Naturally, most evidence of coastal habitation from this period is now conveniently located under several hundred feet of ocean. This brings us to one of the most frustrating aspects of searching for ancient civilizations. We're looking in the wrong place. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than today, the world's coastlines were completely different. What's now underwater continental shelf was prime real estate. The areas we think of as coastal regions today would have been inland territories back then. If you wanted to find evidence of Ice Age civilizations, you'd need to search areas that are currently deep underwater, which, unsurprisingly, is significantly more difficult than digging holes on dry land. Consider this: the Mediterranean Sea was partially enclosed by exposed land bridges. The Persian Gulf was a river valley. The English Channel was dry land connecting Britain to continental Europe. Indonesia and the surrounding islands were part of a massive landmass called Sundaland. These weren't just narrow strips of beach. We're talking about areas the size of India that are now completely submerged. That's a lot of potential civilization building space that's currently inaccessible to most archaeologists, unless they're really into scuba diving and have generous research budgets. And here's where the flood myths come in. Every ancient culture has stories about catastrophic floods. The Epic of Gilgamesh from Mesopotamia describes a great flood that destroys humanity. The biblical story of Noah's Ark is probably the most famous. Hindu texts describe multiple cycles of floods and destruction. Greek mythology has the flood of Deucalion. Chinese, Native American, Aboriginal Australian cultures all have detailed flood narratives. Now, the standard academic response has been, these are just myths. People see local floods and imagine global ones, which would be convincing if these stories weren't so remarkably consistent in their details across cultures that never had contact with each other. These myths don't just describe random flooding. They describe civilization-ending catastrophes. They talk about advanced societies that became too proud, too corrupt, or simply unlucky, and were wiped out by waters covering the earth. They mention survivors who preserved knowledge and rebuilt. They describe the world being fundamentally different after the floods, different geography, different climate, different conditions for life. And all of these myths cluster around roughly the same time period: the end of the Ice Age, the Younger Dryas transition, the period when we know from geological evidence that massive flooding actually occurred. Coincidence? Maybe. Or maybe these are cultural memories of actual events, passed down through oral tradition and eventually written down as religious or mythological texts. The Greek philosopher Plato, writing around 360 BC, described Atlantis as an advanced civilization destroyed by catastrophic flooding and earthquakes in a single day and night. Now, most scholars consider Atlantis purely allegorical, a story Plato invented to make philosophical points about hubris and divine punishment. But Plato claimed he got the story from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests, who insisted it was historical fact preserved in their temple records. The Egyptian priests told Solon that his people had forgotten their own history because catastrophic events periodically destroyed civilizations, leaving only scattered survivors who had to rebuild from scratch. Which is either an incredibly specific piece of fiction or actual historical knowledge preserved by a culture known for keeping detailed records going back thousands of years. So let's talk about what's actually under the ocean, because this is where theory meets evidence and things get properly weird. Starting with Bimini Road, an underwater rock formation off the Bahamas discovered in 1968. At first glance, it looks like a deliberately constructed road or wall. Linear arrangement of rectangular limestone blocks stretching for about half a mile underwater. The blocks are remarkably uniform in size. They're arranged in a way that looks suspiciously organized, and they appear to be resting on support stones, which natural formations don't typically do. The alternative archaeology crowd immediately declared it proof of Atlantis or some other lost civilization. The mainstream archaeologists immediately declared it a natural formation called beach rock, and they've been arguing about it ever since. The natural formation theory holds that the limestone fractured along natural joint patterns, creating rectangular shapes purely by coincidence. Which is geologically possible. Rocks do fracture in regular patterns under certain conditions. The problem is that beach rock formations typically occur in intertidal zones and show specific characteristics that the Bimini Road blocks don't quite match. Plus, there's evidence of what appears to be modified stones, tool marks, and even anchor stones that look distinctly artificial. Some researchers claim they've found a second tier of stones beneath the visible layer, suggesting deliberate construction. Others say it's just more natural rock. Everyone agrees it looks really weird for a natural formation, but nobody can definitively prove it either way. Then we've got the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan, which makes Bimini Road look subtle by comparison. This is a massive underwater rock formation featuring what appear to be terraces, ramps, pillars, and even what looks like a carved face. It was discovered in 1987 by a dive tour operator who was probably not expecting to find underwater architecture that day. The formation includes 90-degree angles, parallel edges, and stacked platforms that seem to defy natural geological processes. It's like someone tried to build an underwater pyramid and got about halfway through before giving up and leaving it for future divers to puzzle over. The researcher who's made Yonaguni his life's work, Masaki Kimura, argues that the site shows clear evidence of human modification. He points to features like a stone pillar, carved animal figures, tool marks on the rocks, and a stepped pyramid structure that would require explanation if it's purely natural. Other geologists look at the same features and say, it's just sandstone and mudstone that eroded along natural fracture lines. Because apparently Earth just sometimes decides to erode rocks into perfect right angles and stacked terraces for fun. The dating is also controversial. If it is artificial, it would have been above water during the Ice Age, which means it could be over 10,000 years old, which would make it older than the Egyptian pyramids, Stonehenge, and pretty much every other ancient structure we know about. Not exactly an easy pill for conventional archaeology to swallow. But wait, There's more. Because Yonaguni and Bimini Road aren't isolated cases, there's the underwater structures off the coast of Cuba, discovered in 2001 using sonar technology. These showed what appeared to be symmetrical stone structures arranged in geometric patterns at depths of around 2,000 feet. That depth would require them to be incredibly ancient, like 50,000 years or more ancient, which is so far outside accepted human history that most researchers just politely declined to engage with the findings. The Cuban government promised further research, but then mysteriously stopped talking about it, which definitely doesn't fuel any conspiracy theories at all. There are the underwater ruins off the coast of India near the Gulf of Cambay, where researchers found what appears to be a massive urban settlement submerged around 120 feet underwater. They recovered artifacts including pottery, beads, and fossilized wood that allegedly dates back 9,500 years. If confirmed, this would make it one of the oldest known cities in the world, predating Mesopotamian civilization by several thousand years. Naturally, the findings are controversial, with debates about whether the structures are natural formations, whether the dating is accurate, and whether those artifacts actually came from the site or were accidentally mixed in with sediment. Standard archaeological fun and games. Off the coast of Egypt, underwater archaeologists have found the ruins of ancient Alexandria and Heracleion, cities that were partially submerged by a combination of earthquakes, tsunamis, and sea level rise. These are accepted historical sites. We know these cities existed because we have written records about them. But their submersion demonstrates how easily coastal civilizations can disappear beneath the waves. If we know about these cities only because they sank relatively recently, and we have historical accounts of them, what about cities that sank thousands of years earlier, before writing was common, before records were kept? How many Alexandrias are sitting on the ocean floor with no one left who remembers their names? The Mediterranean alone has revealed dozens of submerged settlements, some dating back thousands of years. The problem is that underwater archaeology is expensive, dangerous, and time-consuming. You can't just send a grad student with a shovel. You need specialized diving equipment, underwater excavation tools, preservation techniques for artifacts that have been underwater for millennia, and research vessels that cost serious money to operate. Most archaeological funding goes to terrestrial sites because they're more accessible and less likely to result in anyone needing decompression chambers, which means the vast majority of the ocean floor remains unexplored, and any evidence of ancient coastal civilizations remains conveniently out of reach. Here's the really frustrating part. We know from modern underwater surveys that there are anomalous structures all over the ocean floor. Sonar imaging has revealed geometric formations, linear features, and rectangular shapes in areas that should just be boring ocean bottom. But confirming whether these are natural or artificial requires physical examination, dating of materials, and detailed analysis that rarely happens because of funding limitations and the sheer difficulty of underwater work. So we're left with tantalizing sonar images of things that look suspiciously artificial, but which could just as easily be wishful thinking and pareidolia, our tendency to see patterns where none exist. The continental shelf hypothesis addresses this problem directly. During the last glacial maximum around 20,000 years ago, sea levels were about 400 feet lower than today. This exposed enormous areas of what's now continental shelf, the shallow underwater extensions of continents. These areas would have had ideal conditions for human habitation: coastal access for fishing, fertile land from river valleys, moderate climate. If early advanced civilizations developed in these regions, as makes logical sense, then the evidence is now underwater. And not just underwater, but buried under thousands of years of sediment, which makes finding and excavating it even more challenging. Population models suggest that during the Ice Age, a significant portion of humanity would have lived in these now submerged coastal regions. When sea levels rose, these populations would have been forced to migrate inland, abandoning their cities and settlements to the rising waters. Some knowledge would have been preserved, transmitted by survivors who managed to relocate. Other knowledge would have been lost as communities were destroyed or scattered. This would explain why civilization seems to suddenly appear around 10,000 years ago in places like Mesopotamia and Egypt. It's not that humans suddenly got smart. It's that they were rebuilding in new locations after being displaced from flooded coastal regions. This hypothesis also explains the flood myths. They're not exaggerations of local floods. They're cultural memories of the actual historical displacement of entire populations by rising seas. When your entire world is the coastal region where your people have lived for thousands of years, and that region gradually disappears underwater over several generations, that's going to leave a mark on cultural memory. The stories get passed down, they get embellished, they get integrated into religious and mythological frameworks. But at their core, they're remembering something that actually happened. The challenge is proving any of this. Natural formations can look artificial. Underwater archaeology is limited by technology, funding, and accessibility. Dating materials that have been underwater for millennia is tricky and often controversial. And even when you find something interesting, you have to fight through layers of academic skepticism, institutional resistance, and the basic fact that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. It's not enough to find an underwater structure that looks artificial. You need to prove it's artificial, date it accurately, explain who built it and why, and do all of this while fighting against a research establishment that's pretty committed to the current historical timeline. But here's what we know for certain. Catastrophic events happened. Sea levels rose dramatically. Coastal regions were submerged. Ancient cultures have consistent stories about floods destroying advanced civilizations. We've found underwater structures that don't have satisfactory explanations. And we've barely scratched the surface of underwater archaeological exploration. Does this prove there were advanced Ice Age civilizations that got wiped out by rising seas? No. Does it suggest that possibility deserves serious investigation rather than dismissive skepticism? Absolutely. And does it make you look at the ocean differently, knowing that beneath those waves might be the ruins of cities, cultures, and civilizations that we've completely forgotten about? Yeah, it kind of does. The ocean isn't just water, it's a time capsule, covering secrets we're only just beginning to glimpse. If you're still with me after all this talk about underwater cities and catastrophic floods, congratulations. You're either genuinely curious or you've committed to questioning everything you learned in school. Either way, buckle up, because we're about to discuss massive stone structures that shouldn't exist, built by people who supposedly didn't have the capability to build them, using techniques we still can't fully explain. Welcome to the world of megalithic mysteries, where the rocks themselves are the most stubborn witnesses to a past we don't quite understand. Let's start with Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, which has been making archaeologists uncomfortable since its discovery in the 1990s. This site is a temple complex featuring massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing up to 20 tons, arranged in circular formations and covered with intricate carvings of animals, symbols, and abstract patterns. The impressive part? It dates to approximately 11,500 years ago. The problematic part? According to everything we thought we knew about human development at that time, the people building this should have been simple hunter-gatherers focused on finding their next meal, not constructing elaborate religious complexes that required sophisticated planning, organization, and engineering knowledge. Here's the timeline problem in a nutshell. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture. It predates pottery. It predates writing. It predates the wheel, metal tools, and basically every technology we associate with advanced civilization. The people who built this were supposedly living in small nomadic groups, following animal herds and gathering wild plants. Their idea of permanent architecture should have been a well-constructed tent, not a multi-ton stone temple with astronomical alignments and artistic carvings that would make modern sculptors sweat. And yet, there it is, sitting in the Turkish hillside like a massive stone middle finger to conventional archaeological theory. The construction challenges alone are mind-boggling. These weren't small rocks you could move with a few friends and some rope. We're talking about pillars that weigh as much as fully loaded city buses, quarried from bedrock, transported across rough terrain, and then erected vertically with precision. The quarrying marks show they used stone tools to carve these megaliths from solid limestone. Stone tools. That's like building a skyscraper using only hand tools from your garage. Technically possible if you have infinite time and patience, but why would you do it that way if you had any alternative? Unless, of course, you didn't have an alternative because metal tools hadn't been invented yet. But wait, it gets weirder. The site shows evidence of deliberate burial. After using these structures for maybe 1,000 years, the builders intentionally filled them in with debris and soil, essentially creating artificial hills that hid the temples from view. Why build something so elaborate just to bury it? One theory is that it was a form of decommissioning, ritual closure of sacred spaces. Another theory suggests they were preserving the site for future discovery, creating a time capsule. A third option is that something happened that made them want to hide these structures, though what that might have been is pure speculation. It's like building a cathedral and then deliberately burying it instead of just letting it fall apart naturally. Not exactly standard operating procedure. The astronomical alignments at Göbekli Tepe add another layer of mystery. The structures appear to be oriented toward specific stellar phenomena, suggesting the builders had detailed knowledge of celestial movements. They weren't just stacking rocks randomly. They were creating deliberate configurations based on astronomical observations, which means these primitive hunter-gatherers were also practicing sophisticated astronomy, tracking stellar positions, and incorporating cosmic alignments into their architecture. Because apparently, when you're not busy hunting and gathering, you've got plenty of time for advanced mathematical calculations and long-term astronomical observation. Makes perfect sense. And Göbekli Tepe isn't alone. It's just the most dramatic example of a pattern that repeats globally. Across continents, separated by oceans and thousands of miles, ancient cultures built massive stone structures using similar techniques and featuring similar characteristics. We've got Stonehenge in England, built around 5,000 years ago with stones weighing up to 50 tons transported from quarries 150 miles away. We've got the megalithic temples of Malta, dating to 5,500 years ago, featuring precision stonework and astronomical alignments. We've got Karnak in France, with thousands of standing stones arranged in rows stretching for miles. And that's just Europe. Head to South America and you'll find Sacsayhuaman in Peru, where massive stone blocks weighing over 100 tons are fitted together so precisely you can't slide a piece of paper between them. The Inca are credited with building this, but even they claimed they found it already there, built by an earlier civilization. The stones aren't held together with mortar. They're shaped so perfectly that gravity and friction do all the work. Modern engineers look at this and basically shrug, because replicating that precision with hand tools is theoretically possible but practically insane. It's like assembling a jigsaw puzzle, where each piece weighs as much as a loaded cement truck and needs to fit perfectly on the first try. Then there's Baalbek in Lebanon, home to the largest cut stones ever used in construction, the famous trilithon blocks, each weighing around 800 tons. That's 1.6 million pounds per stone. Moving these blocks would challenge modern engineering with cranes and heavy machinery. The Romans built a temple complex on top of these blocks and essentially said, yeah, we built on top of these giant foundation stones, but we definitely didn't move them here. Which leaves us with the question of who did move them, and how, and why. Anyone thought, you know what this temple needs? Foundation stones that weigh as much as multiple fully loaded 747s. Easter Island's Moai statues are another classic example. These massive stone figures, some weighing up to 80 tons, were carved from volcanic rock and somehow transported across the island to their final positions. The islanders told early European visitors that the statues walked to their locations, which sounds like mythology until you watch modern researchers demonstrate that rocking the statues side to side can actually move them forward. It works, but it requires massive coordination, lots of rope, and presumably someone yelling directions like an ancient orchestra conductor. Little to the left. No, your other left. Stop. We've tipped it over. Start again. What's fascinating about all these megalithic sites is the pattern of similarities despite geographic separation. They use massive stones when smaller ones would be easier. They demonstrate precision fitting and astronomical alignments. They show evidence of sophisticated planning and organization. They incorporate similar symbolic elements, circles, alignments with solstices and equinoxes, sacred geometry. Either these similarities emerged independently because humans across the world coincidentally developed the same ideas about monumental architecture, or there was some kind of shared knowledge base, some common cultural heritage that spread across continents and influenced multiple cultures. The mainstream explanation is convergent evolution. Humans everywhere tend to develop similar solutions to similar problems. Need a permanent structure? Use stone. Want to impress the gods? Make it big. Interested in tracking seasons for agriculture? Align it with the sun. All logical. The alternative explanation is that these structures reflect a shared cultural heritage from an earlier, more unified global civilization that fractured and spread across continents, carrying similar architectural and astronomical knowledge too. Different regions. The legacy of this earlier civilization would be these massive stone structures, built by successor cultures trying to maintain or recreate lost knowledge. This brings us to the concept of civilization before civilization. The idea that the established chronology of human development is incomplete at best and potentially wrong at worst. The standard story goes like this. Humans were hunter-gatherers for hundreds of thousands of years. Then around 10,000 BC, someone in the Fertile Crescent figured out agriculture, which led to permanent settlements, which led to cities, which led to writing and civilization. Mesopotamia gets credit as the first civilization around 4000 BC. Egypt shows up shortly after, and from there, civilization spreads across the world in a nice linear progression. Clean, simple, satisfying. Except the evidence keeps not cooperating with this narrative. Göbekli Tepe predates agriculture but shows organizational complexity that should require agricultural surplus to support. Sites in South America show sophisticated engineering that predates local agricultural development. Genetic studies reveal population movements and mixing that don't match the traditional migration models. Linguistic analysis finds connections between languages that shouldn't share common roots. It's like trying to force puzzle pieces together when they clearly don't fit, then insisting the puzzle is correct and the pieces are just weird. Take genetics, for instance. Modern DNA analysis has revealed some interesting complications to the human migration story. We've found genetic markers in populations that suggest ancient mixing between groups separated by thousands of miles. We've discovered that population movements were far more complex than the simple humans left Africa, spread out, stayed isolated model. There's evidence of back migrations, multiple waves of settlement, and genetic exchanges between populations that supposedly never met. Either ancient humans were way more mobile than we thought, or our timeline of human movement needs serious revision. Linguistic connections present similar problems. Proto-Indo-European, the hypothetical common ancestor of languages from India to Ireland, supposedly spread from a single origin point. But linguistic analysis keeps finding connections that don't fit the standard diffusion model. Words for maritime terms, agricultural practices, and cultural concepts that appear in languages separated by vast distances and supposedly isolated for thousands of years. Either there was far more ancient contact between cultures than we recognize, or language evolution is even more complex than we understand. Cultural similarities across continents raise the same questions. Why do cultures worldwide have pyramid structures? Why do flood myths appear in societies that never had contact? Why do creation stories from separate continents share remarkably similar elements? The standard answer is universal human psychology. We all face similar challenges and develop similar mythological frameworks to explain the world. Which is reasonable, but it doesn't quite explain the specific details that match across cultures, the precise correspondences that seem to require either contact or shared source material. The concept of cultural amnesia addresses these puzzles from a different angle. What if human civilization has experienced multiple cycles of advancement and collapse? What if knowledge was developed, then lost during catastrophic events, then slowly rediscovered by survivor populations? This would explain why megalithic sites seem to show knowledge that appears, disappears, and reappears across time periods. It would explain why some ancient cultures possessed astronomical knowledge that seems too advanced for their supposed technological level. It would explain the legends of golden ages and lost wisdom that appear in mythology worldwide. Think about it from a practical standpoint. If a civilization-ending catastrophe happened tomorrow, what would survive? Metal corrodes, wood rots, plastic degrades, electronic storage becomes useless without power and compatible technology. Paper burns or decays. The only things that reliably last thousands of years are massive stone structures and information encoded in oral tradition or extremely durable materials. 1,000 years from now, the most visible remnants of our civilization would be stone monuments, foundations of large buildings, and scattered indestructible artifacts. Everything else would be gone or severely degraded. Now push that timeline back 10,000 or 20,000 years. Add some catastrophic sea level rise that submerges coastal areas where most people lived, and you've got a recipe for near-complete erasure of a civilization. The survivor populations would retain some knowledge. Oral traditions would preserve stories of what was lost. Practical skills might be maintained or adapted. But complex technologies requiring extensive infrastructure would be gone. Writing systems might be lost if not enough literate people survived. Astronomical knowledge might be reduced to basic observations for tracking seasons. Advanced mathematics might devolve into practical counting. Within a few generations, the survivor societies would be rebuilding from a much more primitive baseline, maintaining fragments of earlier knowledge, but missing the context and infrastructure that made that knowledge fully useful. This is where the megalithic structures become crucial. If you're trying to preserve astronomical knowledge through a catastrophic period, you can't rely on written records that might be destroyed or forgotten. But you can encode that knowledge in massive stone structures that will outlast any disaster. Alignments with solstices and equinoxes don't require maintenance. They're built into the structure itself. The stones become a permanent record of astronomical positions, seasonal changes, and mathematical relationships. Future generations might not remember why the stones were positioned that way, but they'll be able to observe and eventually rediscover the astronomical patterns the structures demonstrate. This hypothesis explains several puzzling aspects of megalithic sites. Why build with such massive stones when smaller ones would be easier? Because you're building for permanence through catastrophe. Why include astronomical alignment? Because you're encoding cosmic knowledge in indestructible form. Why do similar patterns appear worldwide? Because survivor populations from a common cultural heritage spread to different regions after catastrophic events, carrying architectural and astronomical knowledge that manifested in local building projects. The megalithic structures aren't primitive attempts at architecture. They're sophisticated information storage systems designed to outlast civilizational collapse. The counter-argument from mainstream archaeology is straightforward. There's no evidence of a global prehistoric advanced civilization. No cities, no writing systems, no clear technological artifacts from the proposed time period. The similarities between megalithic sites can be explained by universal human tendencies and gradual cultural diffusion. The astronomical knowledge can be explained by long-term observation. You don't need advanced technology to track the sun and stars, just patience and record-keeping. The massive construction can be explained by abundant labor and cultural motivation. If you've got a few thousand people and a strong religious conviction, you can move impressively large stones with rope and determination. All valid points. The lack of clear physical evidence for advanced prehistoric civilization is the strongest argument against the hypothesis. But it's worth noting that absence of evidence isn't conclusive evidence of absence, especially when we're talking about time periods and locations where preservation would be minimal. We've barely explored the ocean floors where Ice Age coastal populations would have lived. We've excavated a tiny fraction of potential archaeological sites worldwide. We've only recently developed technologies like LiDAR that can detect structures hidden under vegetation or soil. Every year brings new discoveries that push back the timeline of human achievement. Earlier agriculture, earlier metallurgy, earlier complex societies. The White Sands footprints in New Mexico, dated to 23,000 years ago, completely rewrote the timeline for human presence in the Americas. One discovery, verified through multiple dating methods, and suddenly, the whole model of American settlement had to be revised. If something that fundamental can change with a single well-documented find, how confident should we be about other aspects of the timeline? How many other assumptions are sitting on shaky foundations, waiting for the right discovery to topple them? Whether or not you buy into the lost civilization hypothesis, the megalithic structures remain as stone witnesses to capabilities and knowledge that challenge our comfortable narratives about steady progress from primitive to advanced. These aren't crude rock piles. They're sophisticated engineered structures that required planning, organization, astronomical knowledge, and construction techniques we still don't fully understand. They represent a level of human achievement that official chronology doesn't quite account for, pointing toward a past that's more complex and more interesting than the simplified version we teach. And sometimes, when you're standing in front of a 20-ton carved stone pillar that's been standing for 11,500 years, built by people who supposedly didn't have the technology or organization to create it, the most honest response is simple amazement, and the admission that maybe, just maybe, we don't have the whole story figured out yet. So we've established that ancient history is weird, megalithic structures shouldn't exist according to our timeline, and the ocean is probably hiding entire civilization. Now let's talk about the people who've been searching for these lost worlds. Because the history of archaeological expeditions is absolutely wild. We're talking about quests driven by everything from scientific curiosity to religious fanaticism to straight-up political propaganda. And some of these expeditions were so bizarre, so ethically questionable, or so politically charged that they read like rejected Indiana Jones scripts. Let's start with the elephant in the room. The Nazi archaeological expeditions. Yes, really. The Third Reich, when not busy being historically evil, was weirdly obsessed with finding mystical artifacts and proving their racial theories through archaeology. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS and genuinely one of history's worst people, created an entire organization called the Ahnenerbe, dedicated to researching ancestral heritage. Their mission was supposedly scientific research into Germanic history and culture. Their actual activities were considerably more unhinged. The Ahnenerbe sent expeditions all over the world searching for evidence that would support Nazi ideology. They went to Tibet looking for the origins of the Aryan race, because apparently someone thought, let's combine racism with high-altitude mountaineering. They searched for the Holy Grail, the Spear of Destiny, and various other religious artifacts that would supposedly grant mystical power. They investigated runic inscriptions, megalithic sites, and ancient texts, desperately trying to prove that Germanic peoples were the original master race descended from advanced ancient civilizations. It was pseudoscience with a massive budget and terrifying political backing, which is basically the worst-case scenario for archaeological research. The 1938 expedition to Tibet is particularly notorious. Led by Ernst Schaefer, the team spent months in the Himalayas supposedly conducting ethnographic research, but really they were looking for Shambhala, the mythical Buddhist kingdom said to hold ancient wisdom and spiritual power. They measured skulls, collected artifacts, documented local cultures, and generally acted like the worst kind of colonial academics while searching for mystical cities and supposed evidence of Aryan origins. Unsurprisingly, they didn't find Shambhala, though they did manage to bring back crates of specimens and data that was less groundbreaking archaeological discovery and more deeply problematic pseudoscientific measurements. But here's the thing. While the Nazi expeditions were driven by horrific ideology and terrible science, they weren't unique in mixing politics with archaeology. Every major power in the 19th and 20th centuries used archaeological research as a tool of empire, propaganda, and national identity. The British Empire shipped entire archaeological sites back to London museums, calling it preservation, while everyone else called it looting. French expeditions claimed ownership of discoveries in their colonial territories. American archaeologists in Latin America operated with barely concealed attitudes of cultural superiority. Everyone was using archaeology to prove their nation's greatness, legitimize colonial rule, or demonstrate cultural superiority. The search for legendary cities became particularly charged with national and ideological significance. Percy Fawcett's expeditions into the Amazon in the early 1900s were looking for a lost city he called Z, which he believed was the remnant of an advanced ancient civilization. Fawcett disappeared in 1925, along with his son and another explorer, becoming one of archaeology's most famous mysteries. His disappearance inspired dozens of rescue expeditions, conspiracy theories about hidden civilizations, and eventually the realization that maybe trekking into the Amazon with minimal supplies and maximum confidence wasn't the best research. Methodology. What's interesting about Fawcett's quest is that he was partially right. There were complex societies in the Amazon. We've since discovered evidence of large pre-Columbian civilizations with sophisticated agricultural systems, engineered landscapes, and urban centers. Fawcett's mistake wasn't thinking advanced cultures existed there. It was imagining them as stone cities resembling European architecture, rather than the integrated forest civilizations they actually were. He was looking for the wrong thing in the right place, which is frustratingly close to success, but still ends with you lost in the jungle. The role of secret societies in archaeological quests adds another layer of weirdness. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, various esoteric orders, all claimed special knowledge about ancient mysteries and funded expeditions to prove their theories. Some of this was relatively benign. Rich people with eccentric interests funding archaeological research that sometimes produced real results. Some of it was considerably more problematic. Treasure hunting disguised as research, looting sites for artifacts to add to private collections, or destroying archaeological contexts in pursuit of specific objects. The Smithsonian Institution has been at the center of various conspiracy theories about suppressing archaeological evidence. The theories claim the Smithsonian has hidden discoveries of giant skeletons, advanced prehistoric artifacts, and evidence of ancient civilizations that would rewrite history. The reality is more mundane. The Smithsonian has massive collections that include mislabeled specimens, outdated exhibits, and plenty of items in storage because museums have limited display space. That's not conspiracy. That's just the logistics of running a major institution with millions of artifacts. Though I'll admit, we lost it in the storage system is less exciting than we're hiding evidence of giants. But there have been genuine cases of archaeological findings being suppressed or hidden for political reasons. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1947, were controlled by a small group of scholars who restricted access for decades, leading to accusations of religious censorship and deliberate suppression of controversial content. The controversy wasn't about ancient civilizations, but it demonstrated how controlling access to archaeological materials can serve various agendas. Similarly, discoveries that challenge national narratives or religious doctrines in various countries have faced restrictions, delays in publication, or outright denial of access to researchers. China's approach to archaeology provides a fascinating case study in state control of the past. The Chinese government tightly controls archaeological research, particularly at sites that might challenge official historical narratives or reveal inconvenient facts about ethnic minorities and historical borders. The Tarim Basin mummies, for instance, naturally preserved bodies showing Caucasian features in Western China dating back thousands of years, were initially restricted from international research because they complicated narratives about who lived, where, and when. Eventually, the research was permitted, but the initial restriction demonstrated how archaeology can become politically sensitive when it challenges national identity stories. Then there's the whole situation with Antarctica, which has spawned more conspiracy theories than any continent should reasonably generate. The theories range from relatively plausible, there might be archaeological sites under the ice, to absolutely bonkers. There's a secret Nazi base, or ancient alien technology, or the entrance to a hollow Earth. The Antarctic Treaty of 1961 strictly regulates activities on the continent, limiting military use and requiring international cooperation for research. This has been interpreted by conspiracy theorists as evidence that governments are hiding discoveries in Antarctica. The more rational explanation is that Antarctica is incredibly hostile to human activity. Research there is phenomenally expensive, and coordinating international access to avoid conflicts makes practical sense. That said, there are legitimate mysteries about Antarctica. We know from ice core samples that the continent wasn't always covered in ice. We know there are subglacial lakes, mountains, and valleys under the ice sheet that we've barely explored. We know that as ice melts and shifts, new features are revealed that sometimes show geometric patterns or unusual formations. Whether any of these are archaeological remains or just natural features is unknown, because investigating them would require drilling through thousands of feet of ice, which is technically challenging and wildly expensive. So we're left with tantalizing radar images of things under the ice that might be nothing, might be natural formations, or might, possibly, be something genuinely interesting that we won't be able to properly investigate for decades. Now, speaking of actually investigating things properly, let's talk about the technological revolution that's completely transformed archaeology in the past few decades. Because while the Nazi expeditions were measuring skulls and searching for mystical artifacts, modern archaeology has gotten seriously high-tech. We're talking about technology that can see through jungle canopy, detect structures under desert sand, and map underwater sites without anyone getting wet. It's like archaeology got handed a cheat code. LiDAR, light detection and ranging, has been the game changer. This technology uses laser pulses to create detailed 3D maps of ground surfaces, and the absolutely magical part is that it can penetrate forest canopy to reveal the ground underneath. For archaeologists working in heavily forested regions, this is basically X-ray vision for the Earth. You fly over an area that looks like unbroken jungle, run LiDAR scanning, process the data, and suddenly, you're looking at the outlines of ancient cities, roads, agricultural terraces, and settlement patterns that were completely invisible from the ground level. The Angkor Wat complex in Cambodia is a perfect example. Everyone knew about the famous temples. They're massive stone structures that tourists visit by the thousands. But LiDAR surveys revealed that surrounding the temples was an enormous urban complex with sophisticated water management systems, roads, neighborhoods, and infrastructure extending for hundreds of square miles. We thought we knew Angkor Wat. Turns out we were looking at maybe 5% of the actual site. The rest was hiding under jungle canopy, invisible to traditional archaeological survey methods, waiting for LiDAR to expose it like the world's largest reveal party. In Central America, LiDAR has discovered entire Maya cities that nobody knew existed. Not small villages, cities with pyramids, plazas, residential areas, and defensive walls. Thousands of structures hidden under jungle for centuries, completely invisible until laser scanning pulled back the botanical curtain. The implications are staggering. Population estimates for Maya civilization have had to be revised upward by millions of people. The extent of Maya agricultural engineering, water management, and urban planning is now understood to be far more sophisticated than previously thought. And all of this was always there. We just couldn't see it through the trees. The Amazon is experiencing similar revelations. For decades, the prevailing theory was that the Amazon rainforest was essentially pristine wilderness before European contact, with only small, scattered indigenous groups practicing minimal-impact subsistence living. LiDAR is systematically destroying that theory. Turns out the Amazon was home to large, complex societies with engineered landscapes, extensive road networks, massive earthworks, and urban centers. We're finding geometric earthwork structures called geoglyphs, huge designs carved into the earth that were completely invisible under forest canopy. We're discovering terra preta, artificially enriched soil that allowed intensive agriculture in areas that should have been too poor for farming. The Amazon isn't pristine wilderness. It's a garden that's been growing wild for 500 years after the catastrophic population collapse following European disease introduction. Satellite imaging has contributed its own share of discoveries. Google Earth has accidentally revealed archaeological sites when amateur researchers noticed unusual features in satellite photos. Professional archaeologists now use high-resolution satellite imagery to identify potential sites, track looting activities, and monitor site destruction in conflict zones. Synthetic aperture radar can penetrate shallow sand coverage, revealing buried structures in desert regions. Magnetometry detects variations in magnetic fields caused by buried structures. Ground-penetrating radar maps subsurface features without excavation. It's a whole toolkit of non-invasive investigation methods that would have seemed like science fiction a generation ago. The Sahara Desert has revealed particularly surprising discoveries. We tend to think of the Sahara as eternal desert, but it hasn't always been dry. During the African humid period, from about 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the region was considerably wetter, with lakes, rivers, and savanna grasslands. Satellite imaging has revealed ancient river systems, lake beds, and settlement patterns from this period, showing that the Sahara once supported substantial human populations. As imaging technology improves, we keep finding more evidence of ancient Saharan civilizations, rock art, megalithic structures, burial sites, and settlements that predate Egypt and North African cultures we usually study. But with all this new technology and all these discoveries comes a thorny ethical question. Just because we can find everything, should we excavate everything? Because here's the uncomfortable truth about archaeology. Excavation is destruction. You can only excavate a site once. Once you've dug through layers, documented artifacts, and removed materials, that specific archaeological context is gone forever. Future archaeologists might have better techniques, better preservation methods, or better analytical tools, but they'll never get to excavate that exact site because you already did it. This creates a genuine dilemma. On one hand, archaeological sites are constantly under threat, from development, looting, climate change, erosion, and natural decay. If you don't excavate and document a site, it might be destroyed before future archaeologists get the chance. On the other hand, excavating with current techniques means future researchers won't have access to the site with whatever improved methods they develop. It's a choice between preserve through study and documentation now versus preserve through non-intervention for better future study. Indigenous communities add another crucial dimension to this question. Many archaeological sites are sacred locations for living cultures, not just dead ruins for academic study. When Western archaeologists excavate burial sites, remove artifacts to museums, or study human remains, they're often violating deeply held cultural and religious beliefs of descendant communities. The scientific value of research has to be balanced against respect for cultural heritage and indigenous rights. The fact that this balance was historically ignored, with archaeologists essentially looting sites and shipping everything to Western museums, doesn't make modern ethical considerations any less important. The repatriation debate has become increasingly prominent. Museums worldwide hold collections acquired through colonial looting, dubious purchases, or excavations conducted without permission from local communities. Should these materials be returned to their places of origin? Should indigenous communities control access to their ancestral sites? Should human remains be reburied rather than studied? There are no simple answers, just competing values about knowledge preservation, cultural respect, scientific research, and historical accountability. Technology has also made looting easier and more profitable. High-resolution satellite imagery that helps archaeologists locate sites also helps looters. Metal detectors, ground-penetrating radar, and other tools are available to anyone with sufficient money. The international antiquities market is worth billions of dollars, creating strong financial incentives for looting. War zones and politically unstable regions are particularly vulnerable. When government authority breaks down, archaeological sites become targets for organized looting operations. Sites in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other conflict areas have suffered catastrophic damage from looting, with artifacts being sold to fund weapons purchases and military operations. So we're in this weird position where technology has given us unprecedented ability to discover and study the past, but also unprecedented capability to damage or destroy it. We can see entire lost cities without leaving our computers, but seeing them also alerts looters to their locations. We can map underground structures without excavation, but eventually someone will want to excavate them, and we have to decide whether the knowledge gained justifies the destruction caused. We can find archaeological sites everywhere, but we can't possibly excavate and properly study all of them with current resources and personnel. The practical result is that archaeology has become increasingly about preservation rather than excavation. Sites are documented, mapped, and monitored, but many are deliberately left unexcavated for future research when better techniques are available. This is frustrating for everyone who wants immediate answers to historical mysteries, but it's probably the responsible approach. The lost cities aren't going anywhere. They've been hidden for thousands of years. They can stay hidden a bit longer until we're better equipped to study them properly without causing irreversible damage. What's clear is that the age of accidental discovery is largely over. We're not going to stumble across Atlantis while looking for something else. Future archaeological discoveries will come from systematic survey using advanced technology, followed by careful excavation by properly equipped teams, with full involvement of local communities and indigenous peoples, ideally followed by leaving most of the site intact for future study. It's not as romantic as treasure hunting or forbidden expeditions, but it's how you actually learn about the past without destroying the evidence in the process. Though I'll admit, we used LiDAR and found it but decided not to dig it up yet, is a less satisfying ending than we fought through jungle, avoided traps, and discovered a golden idol, even if it's the scientifically responsible choice. After all this talk about lost cities, catastrophic floods, and forbidden expeditions, it's time to address something that ties all of this together: the stories. Because every culture on Earth has myths about great floods, lost civilizations, and golden ages before catastrophe struck. And for the longest time, academics treated these as pure fiction, entertaining campfire stories with no historical basis. But what if we've been wrong? What if these myths aren't creative fiction, but corrupted history? Cultural memories of actual events passed down through thousands of years of oral tradition, until they got dressed up in religious and mythological clothing. That would mean our ancestors weren't just making things up for entertainment. They were desperately trying to preserve knowledge of real disasters that destroyed their world. Let's start with the flood myths, because they're everywhere and they're weirdly consistent. The Epic of Gilgamesh from ancient Mesopotamia describes how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a massive flood, warning one man, Utnapishtim, who built a boat, saved his family and animals, and survived to rebuild civilization. Sound familiar? The biblical Noah's Ark story follows the same pattern: divine warning, boat construction, animal preservation, catastrophic flood, lone survivors. The Greek myth of Deucalion and Pyrrha, same deal. The Hindu Matsya Purana, yep, flood and survival story. The Chinese Gunyu myth, flood and heroic intervention. Native American tribes across both continents, flood narratives. Aboriginal Australian Dreamtime stories, you guessed it, floods. Now, the standard academic response has been, well, everyone experiences floods, so everyone makes up flood stories. Which would be convincing if these were just generic, it rained a lot stories, but they're not. These myths describe world-ending cataclysms that covered mountains, destroyed all of civilization, and required divine intervention or heroic effort to survive. They talk about the world being fundamentally different before and after the flood. Different geography, different climate, different conditions for life. They mention advanced civilizations that became corrupt or hubristic and were punished with destruction. They preserve specific details about how long the floods lasted, how high the waters rose, and how survivors repopulated the earth. The parallels are striking, even across cultures that never had contact. The Mesopotamian flood lasted 6 days and 6 nights. The biblical flood lasted 40 days and 40 nights. The Aztec legend describes 4 previous worlds destroyed by floods and catastrophes. Hindu cosmology describes cycles of creation and destruction lasting thousands of years. Greek myths place a great flood after a golden age of humanity. Chinese legends describe the Yellow Emperor and ancient sages who possessed knowledge lost to later generations. These aren't vague similarities. They're specific narrative structures that keep repeating globally. Here's where it gets interesting. Some of these myths contain information that the storytellers couldn't have known unless they were preserving very old knowledge. Australian Aboriginal oral traditions describe the coastline and geography of areas that are now underwater, submerged since the end of the Ice Age over 10,000 years ago. Researchers have verified that these stories accurately describe landscapes that haven't existed within recorded history. The stories aren't mythology in the sense of pure invention. They're encoded geography lessons passed down through hundreds of generations. Grandparents telling grandchildren about the old lands before the waters came, generation after generation, for 10,000 years. The mechanism for this preservation is oral tradition, which we tend to dismiss in the modern world because we're used to written records. But oral tradition isn't just casual storytelling. In many cultures, it's a sophisticated system of information preservation with built-in error correction. Stories are told in specific ways, with rhythm and repetition that aid memory. Important information is encoded in narrative form because human brains remember stories better than raw data. Multiple people learn the stories, creating redundancy. Regular retelling reinforces accuracy. When the story changes, elders correct it. It's not perfect, but it's remarkably effective for preserving information across vast time spans. Studies of oral tradition accuracy have shown that core information can remain stable for hundreds or even thousands of years. Historical events verified through other sources have been found accurately preserved in oral traditions spanning 500 to 1,000 years. Astronomical information about star positions has been recovered from indigenous oral traditions that encode observations from thousands of years ago. If oral tradition can preserve factual information for a millennium, why not 2 millennia? Or 5? Or 10? The idea that myths might contain actual historical data from the end of the Ice Age suddenly seems less crazy and more like the logical result of effective information preservation systems operating over extremely long time periods. The flood myths correlate suspiciously well with what we know about actual geological events at the end of the Ice Age. Around 11,600 years ago, during the Younger Dryas transition, sea levels rose dramatically as ice sheets melted. Coastal regions were inundated. Climate changed rapidly. Megafauna went extinct. Human populations were displaced or destroyed. If you were living through that period, experiencing rapid sea level rise that submerged your ancestral homelands, watching your world literally disappear beneath the waves, you'd probably want to preserve that information for your descendants. And how would you do it without writing? Through stories. Vivid, memorable, emotionally powerful stories about great floods sent by the gods to punish humanity, with heroic survivors who preserved knowledge and rebuilt civilization. The myths about lost civilizations follow similar patterns. Plato's Atlantis, an advanced island civilization destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day and night. The Edfu texts from Egypt, describing a lost island of wisdom bringers who came from a primordial land. Hindu texts mentioning Kumari Kandam, a sunken continent south of India. Japanese legends of Mu, a Pacific continent that sank beneath the waves. Celtic myths about Ys, a city that was flooded and lost. Are these all independent inventions? Or are they cultural memories of actual places lost to rising seas, earthquakes, or other catastrophes, with the specific details morphing over thousands of years of retelling, but the core fact, advanced civilization was destroyed, remaining constant? The cargo cults of the Pacific Islands provide an interesting modern parallel for how myths can encode garbled but real information. During World War II, American and Japanese forces built air bases on remote Pacific islands, bringing unprecedented wealth and technology. After the war ended and the bases closed, some islanders developed rituals involving mock airfields and control towers, hoping to bring back the cargo planes and their deliveries. To an outside observer, these rituals look like pure mythology. Obviously, the fake wooden airplanes won't bring real planes back. But they're not mythology. They're cultural memory of real events. Planes did come, goods were delivered, preserved through ritual after the original context was lost. The cargo cults remember that planes brought goods. They just don't understand the full technological and economic context anymore. Similarly, ancient flood myths might remember that catastrophic floods occurred, that advanced coastal civilizations were destroyed, and that survivors had to rebuild. They just explain it through divine agency because the specific meteorological and geological context was lost. Now, speaking of things that make sense in mythology but seem impossible in reality, let's talk about Antarctica. Because this frozen wasteland at the bottom of the world features in some of the most controversial alternative history theories out there, and honestly, some of the evidence is legitimately weird enough to make you wonder. The basic hypothesis is this. Before Antarctica was covered in ice, it could have been home to an advanced civilization. When the climate changed and the continent froze, that civilization was either destroyed or forced to migrate elsewhere, leaving only traces under the ice. It sounds like pure science fiction, except for the part where old maps seem to show an ice-free Antarctica that shouldn't have been mapped yet. We already mentioned the Piri-Reis map from 1513, but it's worth revisiting because it's genuinely puzzling. This map shows the coastline of Antarctica with remarkable accuracy, and, more importantly, it shows geographical features that are currently under ice, but would have been visible if the continent was mapped before glaciation. The mountains, river valleys, and coastal details match what we've confirmed with modern seismic equipment and ice-penetrating radar. The standard explanation is that Piri-Reis compiled his map from much older sources, and those sources must have been based on maps created when Antarctica was ice-free, which pushes the date of the original surveying back to at least 6,000 years ago, possibly much earlier, when official history says nobody was capable of oceanic navigation or cartographic surveying at that level of sophistication. The Orontius Phineas map from 1531 shows similar features: Antarctica without ice, with rivers and mountain ranges in approximately correct positions. The Buach map from 1754 shows Antarctica as two separate landmasses connected by ice, which is exactly what modern surveys have confirmed exists under the ice sheet. These mapmakers claimed they were copying from older sources, but they couldn't explain where those sources came from, or how ancient cartographers mapped a continent that was supposedly unknown and ice-covered. It's like finding Renaissance paintings of Mars that accurately show features we only discovered with space probes, either an incredible string of coincidences or someone had information they shouldn't have possessed. The geological history of Antarctica complicates this picture considerably. The continent wasn't always frozen. During various periods in Earth's deep past, Antarctica had temperate or even subtropical climate. Trees grew there. Animals lived there. The continent was connected to South America, Africa, Australia, and India as part of the supercontinent Gondwana before breaking apart through tectonic drift. But when we're talking about habitable Antarctica in recent enough history that humans could have lived there, we're looking at much tighter time constraints. The current ice sheet began forming around 34 million years ago, which is way too early for humans. However, there have been periods of partial melting and refreezing, and the extent of ice coverage has varied over time. The key question is whether Antarctica was ice-free or partially ice-free during a period when anatomically modern humans existed and were capable of creating civilizations. The answer is complicated and controversial. Most mainstream geological evidence suggests Antarctica has been substantially ice-covered for millions of years, well before humans evolved. Some alternative theories propose that portions of Antarctica might have been ice-free or seasonally accessible during the period from 15,000 to 10,000 years ago, during the transition out of the last ice age. Ice core data and sediment analysis don't definitively rule out all possibilities of reduced ice coverage during this period, though the evidence strongly suggests the continent was mostly frozen. But here's where things get weird. Modern surveys of Antarctica using ice-penetrating radar, satellite imaging, and seismic techniques have revealed some genuinely anomalous features under the ice. There are subglacial lakes, including Lake Vostok, which is a massive body of water beneath thousands of feet of ice that has been sealed off from the surface for potentially millions of years. There are mountain ranges and valleys that create complex topography under the ice sheet. And there are geometric-looking features that show up on radar scans, straight lines, right angles, circular formations, that could be natural geological features or could potentially be something artificial. The problem is that investigating these features would require drilling through miles of ice, which is technically challenging, enormously expensive, and potentially risky if you're drilling into sealed environments that might contain unique ecosystems. The Antarctic Treaty of 1961 is where conspiracy theories really take off. This international agreement established Antarctica as a scientific preserve, banned military activities, prohibited nuclear testing, froze territorial claims, and required international cooperation for all research activities. From a practical standpoint, this makes sense. Antarctica is incredibly hostile to human activity. Research there is expensive, and coordinating international access avoids conflicts over territorial claims. But from a conspiracy theory standpoint, it looks like governments got together and decided to lock down the continent, restrict access, and keep secrets about what might be under the ice. Add in the fact that certain areas of Antarctica are off-limits even to most researchers, supposedly for environmental protection or because they're designated wilderness areas, and you've got fertile ground for speculation about hidden discoveries. The speculation ranges from plausible to absolutely wild. On the plausible end, there might be archaeological sites under the ice from periods when coastal areas were more accessible. If any ancient peoples reached Antarctica during less frozen periods, evidence of their presence would now be under ice and very difficult to locate or excavate. On the wild end, there are theories about secret Nazi bases established during World War II, alien technology hidden under the ice, entrances to a hollow Earth, ancient advanced civilizations with technology beyond our current capabilities, and various other claims that require progressively more suspension of disbelief. The Nazi base theories at least have some historical foundation. Germany did send an expedition to Antarctica in the 1930s and claimed a section of territory they called New Swabia. What they actually did there, besides mapping and taking photos, remains unclear, providing lots of space for speculation to flourish. What we can say definitively is that Antarctica is still poorly explored despite modern technology. The continent is the size of the United States and Mexico combined, almost entirely covered in ice averaging a mile thick, with temperatures that can reach -100 degrees Fahrenheit, winds over 200 miles per hour, and conditions so hostile that even summer research is logistically challenging and phenomenally expensive. Most of what we know about what's under the ice comes from remote sensing, radar, seismic surveys, satellite imagery, rather than direct observation. The few ice cores that have been drilled provide samples of the ice sheet and some information about climate history, but they're pinpricks in a continental ice mass. We've barely scratched the surface, literally, of what might be under all that ice. So when someone asks, could there be ancient structures under Antarctic ice? The honest answer is, we don't know. And we won't know without massive investment in exploration that probably won't happen anytime soon because it's expensive and politically complicated. When someone asks, do ancient maps show Antarctica without ice? The answer is, some old maps show something that looks suspiciously like ice-free Antarctica, and we're not entirely sure how to explain that unless someone was copying from much older sources that we don't have anymore. When someone asks, is the government hiding discoveries in Antarctica? The answer is, probably not, but the treaty restrictions and access limitations make it impossible to verify, which naturally fuels speculation. What ties the myth analysis and the Antarctica hypothesis together is the core question. How much do we not know about human history? If myths can preserve accurate geographical information for 10,000 years, what else might they be remembering? If maps can show continents that shouldn't have been charted yet, who made the original maps and how? If geological events at the end of the Ice Age were catastrophic enough to create lasting cultural trauma preserved in flood legends worldwide, what might have been lost in those catastrophes? The answers probably aren't as dramatic as ancient super-civilizations with flying machines and crystal power sources, but they might be more interesting than the sanitized version of history where nothing important happened before Mesopotamia, and human progress has been a straight line from primitive to advanced. The truth is likely somewhere in the messy middle, where advanced capabilities emerged, were lost, were rediscovered, and left traces in mythology, cartography, and possibly under Antarctic ice, waiting for us to develop the technology and will to properly investigate them, which is significantly less exciting than Indiana Jones, but hey, reality rarely comes with a dramatic orchestral score. So after all this talk about anomalous artifacts, sunken cities, megalithic mysteries, and controversial theories, we need to address the elephant in the archaeological excavation. What does mainstream science actually think about all this? And spoiler alert, the answer is mostly not much, and we'd prefer if you stopped asking. Which is either responsible scientific skepticism or stubborn resistance to evidence, depending on who you ask and how much coffee they've had. Let's try to be fair to both sides, because honestly, they both have valid points, even if they're talking past each other most of the time. The mainstream academic position on lost civilizations is pretty straightforward. Show us the evidence. Not weird maps that might be interpreted multiple ways. not myths that could be explained as natural human storytelling, not underwater formations that might be geological accidents. Show us cities, show us writing systems, show us clear technological artifacts that demonstrate advanced capabilities. Show us the kind of definitive archaeological evidence that we have for accepted ancient civilizations like Egypt, Mesopotamia, Rome, and China. Because those civilizations left massive amounts of physical remains, buildings, pottery, tools, art, written records, burials, infrastructure. If there were advanced Ice Age civilizations, where are their equivalents? It's a fair question. The burden of proof in science falls on the people making extraordinary claims. If you're proposing that everything we think we know about human history is wrong, you need extraordinary evidence to back it up. Anomalies are interesting, but they're not proof. You can't build a theory of advanced prehistoric civilization on a handful of questionable artifacts, debatable maps, and myths that could have multiple interpretations. That's not how science works. Science requires reproducible evidence, peer review, independent verification, and explanations that account for all the data, not just the bits that support your hypothesis. The academic skeptics point out several major problems with lost civilization theories. First, there's the issue of cultural continuity. Known ancient civilizations show clear developmental progression. You can trace Egyptian civilization from its origins through various periods, seeing how writing, art, architecture, and technology evolved over time. Same with Mesopotamia, China, the Indus Valley. These societies didn't spring into existence fully formed. They developed gradually, leaving archaeological evidence of that development. If there were advanced prehistoric civilizations, where's the evidence of their developmental period? Where are their proto-cities, their early experiments with agriculture and architecture, their technological precursors? Advanced civilization requires infrastructure, supply chains, specialized labor, and accumulated knowledge. All of that leaves traces. Second, there's the problem of population genetics. DNA analysis allows us to track human migrations and population mixing with remarkable precision. We can trace when populations split, when they reunited, how many people were in various groups at different times. The genetic evidence doesn't show signals that would be expected if there were large, advanced populations during the Ice Age that were then catastrophically reduced. We see signals of population bottlenecks, sure, but not the specific patterns that would indicate civilization-level societies being wiped out. The populations that survived the Ice Age transition show genetic patterns consistent with relatively small, scattered groups, not the remnants of collapsed urban civilizations. Third, there's the cultural transmission problem. If advanced civilizations existed and were destroyed, some knowledge should have survived through the survivor populations. But what we see in the archaeological record is a fairly steady progression of technological development, not the preservation of advanced knowledge from an earlier period. Early post-Ice Age societies show capabilities appropriate to their level of development. They're figuring out agriculture, pottery, permanent architecture, gradually accumulating knowledge and skills. They're not demonstrating retained knowledge of advanced techniques from a destroyed earlier civilization. The technology develops in logical sequence, not in the pattern you'd expect from trying to rebuild from fragments of greater knowledge. Fourth, and this is the big one, there's just not much physical evidence. Yes, there are anomalies. Yes, there are structures that are impressively old. Yes, there are maps and myths that raise questions. But when you're talking about entire advanced civilizations existing for thousands of years, you need more than a handful of puzzling artifacts. You need the kind of extensive material culture that every known civilization has left behind. The absence of that evidence isn't just a minor gap. It's a fundamental problem that alternative theories need to address with more than, well, it all got destroyed, or we haven't looked in the right places yet. These are legitimate objections. They're not closed-minded rejection of new ideas. They're the application of standard scientific criteria to extraordinary claims. And honestly, if someone came to you and said, everything you think you know about history is wrong, trust me, you'd probably want to see some pretty convincing evidence before rewriting all the textbooks. That's not unreasonable. But, and this is an important but, the academic skeptics aren't always entirely fair either. Because science is conducted by humans, and humans have institutional biases, career incentives, and psychological investments in existing paradigms. Thomas Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions demonstrated that scientific fields don't change their fundamental understanding smoothly when new evidence appears. Instead, they resist paradigm shifts, explaining away anomalies, dismissing contradictory evidence, and maintaining existing frameworks until the weight of contradictions becomes impossible to ignore. Then suddenly the field shifts to a new paradigm. Everyone acts like this is what they believed all along, and the cycle continues. Archaeology as a discipline has strong institutional biases toward conventional chronology. You don't get tenure by proposing wild revisions of human history. You don't get research funding by challenging established timelines. You don't advance your career by championing theories that make your senior colleagues uncomfortable. Graduate students learn very quickly which topics are acceptable for research and which will get you labeled as a fringe crackpot. This creates a systemic bias against paradigm-challenging research, even when that research might be onto something interesting. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how academic institutions work. The system rewards incremental progress within accepted frameworks and punishes radical departures from orthodoxy. This means that evidence which challenges established chronology faces a much higher burden of proof than evidence that confirms existing beliefs. An artifact that fits conventional understanding gets accepted with standard verification. An artifact that contradicts the timeline gets subjected to extraordinary scrutiny. And if any doubt can be raised about its authenticity, dating, or interpretation, it gets dismissed. This isn't necessarily wrong. Extraordinary claims should require extraordinary evidence. But it does create an asymmetry where conventional theories need to be conclusively disproven before they're abandoned, while alternative theories need to be conclusively proven before they're even seriously considered. The counterarguments from alternative researchers focus on several key points. First, preservation. Advanced civilization doesn't necessarily leave permanent traces, especially over timescales of 10,000 years or more. Wood rots, metal corrodes, paper and organic materials decay. Even stone structures erode, get buried, or are destroyed by natural processes. The most durable artifacts are massive stone constructions, which is exactly what we find scattered across the world in the form of megalithic structures. Everything else would have degraded or been destroyed, especially if the civilizations were coastal and their remains are now underwater and buried in sediment. The absence of evidence could simply reflect the destructive nature of time and geology, not the absence of advanced cultures. Second, dating problems. Archaeological dating methods like radiocarbon have limitations and margin of error. Organic materials can be contaminated. Stratification can be disrupted by geological events. Dating gives approximate ranges, not precise dates. When you're trying to distinguish between built 8,000 years ago and built 12,000 years ago, the error margins matter. Some structures might be significantly older than current dating suggests, but the limitations of dating methods make it difficult to prove. Additionally, later cultures often built on top of, modified, or reused structures from earlier periods, creating confused archaeological contexts where newer and older materials are mixed. Third, catastrophic destruction. If civilization-ending disasters occurred, massive floods, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions, rapid climate shifts, the evidence of advanced cultures could have been systematically destroyed. Coastal cities would be underwater. Structures would be damaged or buried. Populations would be scattered or eliminated. The archaeological record would show exactly what we see: scattered anomalous artifacts, ambiguous ruins, and myths describing catastrophic events. The lack of extensive evidence isn't a problem for the theory. It's exactly what the theory predicts should happen after civilization-ending catastrophes. Fourth, we keep finding things that push back the timeline. The White Sands footprints in New Mexico, dated to 23,000 years ago, completely rewrote the timeline for human presence in the Americas. One discovery, properly verified, and suddenly the entire model of American settlement had to be revised backward by over 10,000 years. Göbekli Tepe pushed back the date of monumental architecture and organized religion by thousands of years. Underwater archaeology keeps finding structures and settlements that challenge existing chronology. Every few years, something is discovered that forces revision of when humans first did something: agriculture, seafaring, architecture, art. If the timeline keeps moving backward with each new discovery, maybe our current understanding is still incomplete. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the messy middle. Were there advanced civilizations with technology exceeding ancient Egypt and comparable to modern industrial society? Probably not. We'd see more evidence of that level of development. Were Ice Age humans completely primitive, living in small nomadic bands with no organizational complexity or accumulated knowledge? Also probably not. The evidence increasingly suggests more sophistication than traditional models allow. The reality is likely that human capabilities and cultural complexity have been underestimated for the deep past, that catastrophic events did disrupt and destroy societies, leaving fragmented evidence, and that our understanding of ancient history is incomplete and continues to evolve as new discoveries challenge existing assumptions. What's clear is that the story of human civilization is more complex than the simplified linear progression we teach. Recent discoveries are forcing revisions across multiple areas of human history and prehistory. Those footprints in white sands are just one example. We're finding older art, older structures, older evidence of complex cognition and cultural development. We're discovering that humans were more mobile, more innovative, and more capable much earlier than previous models suggested. The timeline keeps getting pushed back. The capabilities keep being revised upward, and the simple story of steady progress from primitive to advanced keeps getting messier. Future technologies might finally resolve some of these mysteries. Improved underwater archaeology will explore the continental shelves where Ice Age coastal populations lived. Better remote sensing will detect buried structures under jungle, desert, and ice. Advanced DNA analysis will reveal more about ancient populations and migrations. Improved dating methods will provide more precise chronologies. Machine learning analyzing vast amounts of archaeological data might detect patterns humans have missed. We might finally get definitive answers about whether advanced prehistoric civilizations existed, or we might find that the truth is more nuanced, that human history involved repeated cycles of development and collapse, with knowledge being gained, lost, and rediscovered across vast timeframes. The philosophical implications of these questions are genuinely profound. If we discover conclusive evidence of advanced prehistoric civilizations, what does that mean for humanity? On one hand, it would be humbling. We're not the first. We're not unique. Our current technological civilization might just be the most recent iteration in a cycle that's repeated multiple times. On the other hand, it would be fascinating. Our ancestors achieved more than we realized. Human potential is greater than we thought, and we're connected to a deeper past than our current narratives acknowledge. It might also be instructive. If previous civilizations rose and fell, what can we learn from their trajectory? Did they make mistakes we're repeating? Did environmental catastrophes beyond their control destroy them, or did they collapse from internal problems? What knowledge did they develop that we've since forgotten? If cycles of civilization are real, are we building toward our own peak and eventual decline? Or can we break the pattern by learning from the past? More practically, it might change how we approach our current challenges. If civilizations can be destroyed by natural catastrophes, asteroid impacts, supervolcanic eruptions, rapid climate change, maybe we should take existential risks more seriously. If advanced knowledge can be lost completely within a few generations after catastrophe, maybe we should think harder about preserving information in durable forms that could survive societal collapse. If multiple human civilizations have risen and fallen, maybe our current trajectory isn't as inevitable as we assume. But even if we never find definitive proof of advanced, lost civilizations, the search itself is valuable. It pushes archaeology to explore new areas, develop better technologies, and question established assumptions. It reminds us that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence, and that our understanding of the past is always provisional, subject to revision as new discoveries emerge. It keeps us humble about how much we actually know versus how much we think we know. And it maintains a sense of mystery and wonder about human history that makes the past feel alive and relevant, rather than a dead subject in dusty textbooks. The future of archaeology is going to be increasingly technological, increasingly interdisciplinary, and increasingly surprising. Every year brings discoveries that challenge conventional wisdom. Every decade sees major revisions to timelines and models. The story of human history is being constantly rewritten as new evidence emerges. Whether that story eventually includes advanced prehistoric civilizations, or just reveals more complex and capable ancient peoples than we previously recognized, it's going to be more interesting than the simplified version we learned in school. So where does this leave us? Standing at the intersection of knowledge and mystery, looking at a past that's more complex and less understood than we'd like to admit. The maps are weird, the artifacts are puzzling, the myths are persistent, and the evidence is inconclusive. Maybe there were advanced lost civilizations, maybe there weren't. Maybe the truth is something we haven't even considered yet. But the search continues, the technologies improve, the discoveries accumulate, and slowly, piece by piece, we're recovering a more complete picture of humanity's deep past. And that journey of discovery, with all its controversies, mysteries, and surprises, might be even more valuable than whatever final answers we eventually find. Because staying curious, questioning accepted narratives, and maintaining wonder about where we came from, that's what keeps us pushing forward into an unknown future, hopefully having learned something from all those forgotten civilizations that came before us. Whether they were as advanced as legend suggests, or simply more remarkable than history books admit. Thanks for coming on this journey through impossible archaeology, lost civilizations, and the mysterious depths of human history. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go stare at some megalithic structures and wonder how anyone moved those rocks without modern equipment. Because honestly, after all this research, that question still hasn't been adequately answered, and it's going to bother me forever. Which is probably how it should be. Some mysteries are worth keeping around.